The crash that changed everything. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, leaving the city bathed in a quiet, cool night. Carol Henderson pulled her coat tightly around her as she stepped out of the small community center. It had been another fulfilling evening, organizing food drives and mentoring young girls in her neighborhood. Carol's presence was a cornerstone for many in the community, a beacon of resilience and warmth. She hummed softly as she approached her car, a modest silver sedan she had lovingly named Hope. The vehicle, much like Carol, had been through its share of struggles but remained dependable. She slid into the driver's seat, her movements fluid and practiced, and started the engine. The familiar hum brought comfort, as did the sight of the moonlight reflecting off the empty streets. Carol's road home was uneventful, a winding path through quiet neighborhoods, lined with small houses and tall oaks that seemed to cradle the road. The radio played a soothing jazz melody, and she let her mind wander to plans for the upcoming week: a bake sale for the local church, a career workshop for young women, and perhaps, she mused, a much-needed day off. But life often takes sharp, unanticipated turns. As Carol reached a particularly narrow stretch of road, she noticed headlights swerving in her rearview mirror. Her heart quickened as the vehicle grew closer, zigzagging dangerously. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her instincts screaming caution. The approaching car, a dark SUV, showed no signs of slowing. Before she could process what was happening, the SUV slammed into her car's rear, sending it skidding across the road. The sound of crunching metal and shattering glass echoed in the still night as Carol's car careened into a roadside barrier. Her head snapped forward, the seatbelt cutting into her chest and shoulder. The world spun wildly, colors and sounds melding into chaos. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence. Pain. Carol's breaths came in ragged gasps as she tried to assess her situation. Her hands trembled as she reached for her seatbelt, the pain in her shoulder making the task excruciating. Blood trickled down her forehead from a small gash, staining her crisp white blouse. She glanced around and saw the SUV's driver stumble out, seemingly unhurt, before darting off into the night. The cowardice was almost as painful as her injuries. Her first instinct was to grab her phone, but her bag had fallen into the passenger footwell, just out of reach. Panic set in. Alone on a dark road, injured and vulnerable, Carol fought back tears. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, a steady reminder from her childhood. "Stay calm, baby girl. There's always a solution. Just breathe." And so she did. Carol scanned her surroundings, her eyes landing on a faintly illuminated sign just ahead, a hospital less than 2 miles away. The irony wasn't lost on her. Salvation was within reach, yet it felt insurmountable. Still, she had no other choice. Summoning every ounce of strength, Carol turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered but roared to life. She coaxed the battered vehicle forward, wincing with each jolt. The headlights were dim, one barely functional after the crash, but they guided her toward the hospital. Her prayers became her lifeline as she whispered softly, asking for strength and guidance. The road seemed endless, each mile stretching like an eternity. Her body ached, her vision blurred, and the throbbing in her head grew more pronounced. Yet she pressed on, her determination outweighing the pain. Finally, the hospital sign came into full view, the parking lot bathed in sterile fluorescent light. Carol pulled into the nearest spot, barely managing to cut the engine before slumping back into her seat. Her breath came in short bursts as she willed her body to move. She fumbled with the door handle, her fingers numb and uncooperative. With a burst of resolve, she opened the door and stepped out, swaying slightly before steadying herself against the car. Inside, the emergency room was alive with the buzz of medical staff and patients. Carol's presence drew a few glances, her disheveled state, blood-streaked face, and visibly swollen shoulder told a story of urgency. Yet, no one rushed to her side. "Help," Carol managed to croak, her voice weak but resolute. A nurse at the front desk glanced up briefly before returning her attention to her clipboard. "Take a seat, ma'am. Someone will be with you shortly." Carol stared in disbelief. Shortly. Her vision blurred as she staggered toward the nearest chair, clutching her arm. She lowered herself carefully, the pain flaring with every movement. Minutes felt like hours as she watched others being attended to. A young man with a sprained ankle, a child with a mild fever. Carol's condition seemed invisible to those around her. Desperation clawed at her as her strength waned. She reached into her pocket, her trembling fingers brushing against a hard, cold object. She froze, a sudden surge of clarity piercing through the fog. It was her badge, a symbol of her years of service, dedication, and authority. Carol Johnson wasn't just another patient. She was Special Agent Carol Johnson of the FBI. With her last reserve of energy, Carol pulled the badge from her pocket and held it aloft. The metallic glint caught the light, drawing attention from staff and patients alike. "I need help. Now," she said, her voice carrying the weight of command despite its weakness. The room fell silent. Nurses and doctors exchanged startled glances, the realization of her identity dawning on them. A young nurse rushed forward, her face a mix of guilt and concern. "Ma'am, let's get you into a room right away." As Carol was wheeled into the treatment area, she caught the wide-eyed stares of those who had dismissed her earlier. There was no satisfaction in their discomfort, only a lingering question in her mind. Would they have helped sooner if they had seen her badge first? The sting of prejudice cut deeper than her physical wounds, but Carol wasn't ready to dwell on it. Not yet. For now, she focused on staying conscious as the medical staff finally sprang into action. Her fight wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Confronting indifference. Carol's world tilted slightly as the wheelchair squeaked and jolted its way toward a treatment bay. The bright fluorescent lights overhead blurred into long streaks, making her head throb even more. Her left shoulder burned with every tiny movement, but she held her badge tightly in her lap, a silent reminder of her authority and identity. The nurse pushing her wheelchair kept a hurried pace, avoiding eye contact. "We'll get you settled in Bay 4, she said, her voice clipped. There was an air of awkwardness, as though she wanted to pretend the delay hadn't happened. Carol didn't have the energy to argue or point out the obvious. Instead, she focused on staying alert, her senses dulled by pain and fatigue. When they arrived at Bay 4, a thin curtain was drawn hastily for privacy. Carol was helped onto a stretcher, and the nurse checked her vitals in silence. "The doctor will be with you shortly," she mumbled before retreating quickly. Carol exhaled sharply, her breaths ragged. Shortly. The word seemed to haunt her tonight, a promise that stretched far too long. Her FBI training told her to remain calm, to compartmentalize her emotions, but anger bubbled beneath the surface. It wasn't just the accident or the pain. It was the dismissal, the sense that her life mattered less until she proved otherwise. She glanced down at her badge, its weight both comforting and infuriating. Why should it take this symbol of power for her to be seen as worthy of immediate care? Her thoughts swirled in a chaotic storm, each question fueling the ache in her chest. The faint sound of voices broke through her thoughts. From behind the curtain, she could hear two doctors conversing. Bay 4. One voice, male and authoritative, asked, "That's the woman from the car accident?" "Yes, Dr. Miller," replied another voice, timid and nervous. "She's stable, right? No life-threatening injuries." "Well, she has a head wound and possibly a dislocated shoulder." Dr. Miller cut the nurse off with a sharp laugh. "That can wait. There's a guy in Bay 2 with a pretty nasty sprain from a party. Let's handle that first." Carol's jaw clenched, her fingers tightening around her badge. The indifference in his voice wasn't just unprofessional, it was dehumanizing. Her mind raced as the doctor's footsteps faded. She was a woman bleeding from the head, her shoulder likely fractured or dislocated, and yet a party injury took precedence. The dismissiveness wasn't just negligence, it felt deliberate. Her FBI instincts kicked in. Details mattered, and she committed the moment to memory. Dr. Miller's tone, his words, the flippant way he disregarded her. This wasn't just an oversight. It was a pattern, and she wouldn't let it go unnoticed. The curtain shifted slightly, and another nurse stepped in. A young woman with wide, concerned eyes. "Mrs. Johnson, I'm Nurse Patel. I'm here to clean your wound and check on that shoulder." Her tone was soft but professional, a stark contrast to the doctor's earlier dismissal. Carol nodded weakly, grateful for the nurse's kindness. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice hoarse. As Nurse Patel began cleaning the gash on Carol's forehead, Carol winced at the sting of antiseptic. "You'll need stitches," Patel said gently. "But first, we'll make sure there's no internal bleeding or fractures. The on-call radiologist is ready for a scan." "Who's the attending doctor tonight?" Carol asked, though she already knew the answer. Patel hesitated, her hands stilling briefly. "Dr. Miller," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Carol's lips pressed into a thin line. "I heard him say I could wait while he treated a sprain." The nurse's face flushed with embarrassment, but she said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes. "You don't have to answer," Carol said, her tone soft but firm. "I already know. I'm just making note of it." Patel nodded, resuming her work. Her hands were gentle, her movements careful as she cleaned the blood from Carol's forehead and prepared the area for stitches. Despite the nurse's attentiveness, Carol couldn't shake the growing weight of indignation. This wasn't just about her injuries. It was about a system that allowed people like Dr. Miller to decide who was worthy of care. As Patel finished, another voice interrupted them. "Agent Johnson." Sandra's voice cut through the sterile quiet of the ER like a beacon. Carol turned her head slowly, her heart lifting at the sight of her niece. Sandra Bennett, sharp and confident in her FBI windbreaker, strode into the bay with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. "Niece," Carol managed to say, her voice cracking with relief. Sandra reached her aunt's side, her face a mixture of concern and restrained fury. "I got the call from the officers. Are you okay?" "I've been better," Carol admitted, her attempt at a smile faltering under the weight of pain. "But I'm in good hands now." She glanced at Nurse Patel, who offered a small nod of acknowledgement before stepping back to give them space. Sandra's sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in the partially drawn curtain, the equipment, and the nurse's hasty retreat. "Have you been seen by a doctor?" she asked, her tone laced with suspicion. "Not yet," Carol said, her words deliberate. "Dr. Miller decided I could wait." Sandra's face darkened, her jaw tightening as she processed the statement. "Wait? For what?" "For a sprain," Carol said, her voice calm but pointed. She knew Sandra's temper well enough to recognize the storm brewing behind her niece's composed exterior. Sandra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly as she typed. "We're not letting this slide," she said, her voice low but firm. "This is unacceptable." Before Carol could reply, Sandra marched out of the bay, her badge clipped to her belt catching the fluorescent light. Carol closed her eyes briefly, exhaustion settling over her. She trusted Sandra to fight the battle she couldn't, at least not in her current state. From her stretcher, Carol could hear Sandra's voice rising in the hallway. "I need to speak with the attending physician," Sandra demanded, her tone cutting through the usual hospital buzz. "Dr. Miller is busy," replied a hesitant nurse. "Busy ignoring critically injured patients. I'm Special Agent Sandra Bennett with the FBI, and I'm documenting every second of this negligence. Do you want to be included in the report?" The tension in the hallway was palpable, each word sharp enough to make anyone nearby flinch. Carol couldn't help but smile faintly. Sandra's fire was one of her greatest strengths, and right now, it was exactly what Carol needed. Moments later, Sandra returned, her expression unreadable. "Dr. Alvarez is on her way," she said simply. "Dr. Alvarez?" Carol asked, her curiosity piqued. "A trauma specialist," Sandra explained. "I pulled some strings. You're getting the care you deserve, Aunt Carol. Carol reached out, her fingers brushing against Sandra's arm. Thank you, she whispered, emotion thick in her voice. Sandra's eyes softened as she placed her hand over her aunt's. You don't have to thank me. This is what family does. As they waited for Dr. Alvarez, the weight of the night began to lift slightly. Carol knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time since the crash, she felt seen, heard, and protected. And that was enough to carry her through the next battle. Sandra pulled up a chair next to her aunt's stretcher, her posture rigid and her eyes scanning the room as though daring anyone else to dismiss Carol's condition. Despite her fury, Sandra's movements were gentle as she adjusted the thin hospital blanket over Carol's legs. You shouldn't have to go through this, Sandra said softly, her voice tinged with frustration. Not after everything you've done for others. Carol smiled faintly, though the pain in her shoulder made even small gestures taxing. Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. Maybe this is just another test. Sandra shook her head. This isn't a test, it's injustice. And you've dealt with enough of that in your life. Before Carol could respond, the curtain was swept aside, and a middle-aged woman in scrubs entered. Her presence radiated confidence and competence. The name embroidered on her white coat read Dr. Lucia Alvarez. Good evening, Dr. Alvarez said briskly, her dark eyes scanning Carol's chart as she introduced herself. I'm Dr. Alvarez, and I'll be taking over your care. I've reviewed your case, and we're going to address everything immediately. Sandra stood, extending her hand. I'm Sandra Bennett, Carol's niece. Thank you for stepping in. Dr. Alvarez shook Sandra's hand firmly. No need to thank me. Let's just focus on getting Mrs. Johnson the care she needs. Carol nodded weakly. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Alvarez pulled on a pair of gloves and gently examined Carol's injuries, her touch professional yet careful. You've been through quite the ordeal, she said, her tone calm but empathetic. I'm ordering a full set of x-rays to assess your shoulder, as well as a CT scan to ensure there's no internal bleeding. In the meantime, we'll clean and stitch that forehead laceration. Carol winced as Dr. Alvarez pressed lightly on her shoulder, but the doctor's efficiency was reassuring. You'll feel some discomfort while I work, Dr. Alvarez warned, but I'll do my best to keep you comfortable. Sandra hovered nearby, her arms crossed but her eyes attentive. What about the delay in treatment? My aunt's condition was ignored for over an hour. Dr. Alvarez paused, her gaze meeting Sandra's. I can't speak to what happened before I was called, but I can assure you that she'll receive top priority moving forward. Neglect like that is unacceptable. Sandra's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Thank you. As Dr. Alvarez began cleaning the wound on Carol's forehead, Sandra's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. A message from one of her FBI colleagues. Take it, Carol murmured, noticing Sandra's hesitation. I'll be fine. Sandra reluctantly stepped outside to return the call, leaving Carol and Dr. Alvarez in the treatment bay. The silence was broken only by the soft clinking of medical instruments and the rhythmic beeping of monitors. You're fortunate to have a niece like Sandra, Dr. Alvarez remarked as she worked. She's clearly devoted to you. Carol managed a small laugh despite the pain. She's always been a fighter. Even as a little girl, she'd stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. Dr. Alvarez smiled faintly. It seems to run in the family. Carol didn't respond immediately. Instead, she studied Dr. Alvarez's calm demeanor, the way she methodically tended to each of her injuries without rushing or cutting corners. The contrast between her and Dr. Miller was stark, and it wasn't lost on Carol. Dr. Alvarez, Carol began hesitantly, do you see this kind of indifference often? Patients being dismissed based on perceptions. The doctor paused, her gloved hands stilling momentarily. Unfortunately, yes, she admitted quietly. It's not always blatant, but it happens. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, can affect how care is prioritized. It's something the medical field still struggles with. Carol nodded, her suspicions confirmed. I've spent my career fighting bias in the justice system. It's disheartening to see it here too. Dr. Alvarez's expression softened. It's people like you who inspire change, Mrs. Johnson. Speaking up, holding others accountable. It makes a difference. Before Carol could reply, Sandra re-entered the bay, her expression resolute. The wheels are in motion, she announced, slipping her phone back into her pocket. The hospital administration will be reviewing this incident first thing in the morning. Dr. Alvarez glanced at Sandra, her brows lifting slightly. You don't waste time, do you? Not when it comes to my family, Sandra replied firmly. Dr. Alvarez nodded approvingly before returning her attention to Carol. We're all set for the CT scan. A technician will be here shortly to take you to imaging. Carol reached for Sandra's hand, giving it a weak squeeze. Thank you for being here. You don't have to thank me, Sandra said, her voice softening. This isn't just about tonight. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. As Carol was wheeled toward the imaging department, she felt a glimmer of hope amid the pain and exhaustion. With Sandra by her side and Dr. Alvarez leading her care, she knew she was in good hands. More importantly, she knew this moment of injustice wouldn't be forgotten. It would become a catalyst for change. Shadows of injustice. Carol's stretcher rattled softly as she was wheeled down the quiet hallway to the imaging department. The antiseptic scent of the hospital lingered in the air, mingling with the soft hum of machinery in the background. Every bump sent a fresh wave of pain radiating from her shoulder, but Carol clenched her teeth, determined to stay strong. Sandra walked briskly alongside, her protective instincts in overdrive. She glanced at Carol frequently, searching for signs of distress. How are you holding up, Aunt Carol? She asked, her voice softer now that they were away from the chaos of the emergency room. I've been better, Carol admitted, her voice tinged with exhaustion. But having you here makes it easier. Sandra's expression softened, but her resolve hardened. We'll make sure you're taken care of, and we'll make sure people like Dr. Miller face consequences for their actions, or lack of them. Carol sighed, her thoughts briefly drifting to the countless instances of bias and discrimination she'd encountered throughout her life. She had spent years navigating a world where assumptions were often made before she could speak a word. Tonight was no different. Her injuries weren't visible enough, her presence not loud enough, her urgency not urgent enough, until she flashed her badge. The technician greeted them at the imaging room, her demeanor professional but kind. Mrs. Johnson, we're going to perform a CT scan to check for any internal injuries or bleeding, she explained, gesturing to the machine. It'll only take a few minutes. Try to relax and stay as still as possible. Sandra stepped back, her arms crossed, as Carol was transferred to the imaging table. Watching her aunt wince with every movement sent a fresh wave of anger coursing through her. She had seen Carol as a pillar of strength her entire life. Unshakable, compassionate, and fiercely independent. To see her vulnerable like this was unsettling. Carol closed her eyes as the machine whirred to life, its rhythmic hum filling the room. The dim lighting and mechanical sounds felt strangely calming, almost meditative. Despite the pain and the chaos of the night, she found herself reflecting on the deeper issues at play. It wasn't just about the crash or the dismissal of the hospital. It was about a system that constantly demanded proof of worthiness from people like her. She thought about the young girls she mentored, many of whom faced similar struggles. What lessons would they take from her experience tonight? Would they grow up expecting to be overlooked, or would they learn to fight back like Sandra? When the scan was complete, the technician helped Carol back onto the stretcher. We'll send the images to Dr. Alvarez immediately, she said. She'll review them and come back with a plan. As Carol was wheeled back to her treatment bay, Sandra leaned in. You're doing great, Aunt Carol. Dr. Alvarez is on top of everything, and I'll make sure nothing gets missed. Carol smiled faintly. I know you will. You've always had my back, even when you were little. Sandra's lips curved into a small smile. You taught me to stand up for what's right. That's what I'm doing." Back in the treatment bay, Dr. Alvarez arrived within minutes, a tablet in hand. "Good news," she began, her voice steady and reassuring. "The CT scan shows no signs of internal bleeding or fractures in the skull. Your shoulder, however, is dislocated, and there are glass fragments embedded in the tissue. We'll need to remove the fragments and relocate the joint, which will be painful, but I'll make sure you're comfortable during the procedure." Carol nodded, relief flooding through her at the absence of internal injuries. "Thank you, doctor. Let's get it done." Dr. Alvarez turned to Sandra. "You're welcome to stay, but if you're uncomfortable with the procedure, you can step out." Sandra's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm staying," she said firmly. "She's my family." Dr. Alvarez nodded, appreciating the determination in Sandra's voice. She turned to the nurse assisting her. "Prepare a local anesthetic and sterile instruments. We'll also need a sedative for the reduction." The procedure began with Dr. Alvarez carefully removing the glass fragments from Carol's shoulder. She worked methodically, her movements precise and efficient. Carol winced occasionally, the anesthetic dulling the sharpest edges of the pain, but not eliminating it entirely. "You're doing great, Mrs. Johnson," Dr. Alvarez said, her tone calm and encouraging. "Just a little more, and we'll have this cleaned up." Carol gritted her teeth, her eyes fixed on Sandra, who stood at the foot of the stretcher like a sentry. The sight of her niece's unwavering focus gave her strength. Carol had spent decades supporting others, her community, her family, her country. Now it was her turn to be supported. Once the glass fragments were removed, Dr. Alvarez prepared to relocate Carol's shoulder. She explained each step of the process, her voice steady and reassuring. "You'll feel some pressure and a sharp pain, but it'll be quick. The sedative should help." Carol nodded, bracing herself as Dr. Alvarez carefully manipulated her arm. A sharp, intense pain shot through her shoulder, and she let out a low groan. Then, with a soft pop, the joint slid back into place. The relief was immediate, though the residual ache lingered. "All done," Dr. Alvarez said, stepping back. "We'll keep your arm in a sling to allow the joint to heal. Physical therapy will help restore your range of motion over the next few weeks." Carol exhaled deeply, her body sagging against the stretcher. "Thank you, doctor," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Dr. Alvarez offered a small smile. "It's my job. But I'll be honest, your strength is impressive. Not everyone handles this with such grace." Carol's smile was faint but genuine. "I've had a lot of practice." After Dr. Alvarez left to update the chart, Sandra pulled a chair closer to Carol's bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Carol admitted, but relieved. Sandra leaned forward, her expression serious. "Aunt Carol, we're not letting this go. What happened tonight is part of a larger problem. Dr. Miller's negligence isn't just a bad decision. It's part of a pattern. We need to make sure it's addressed." Carol studied her niece, pride shining in her eyes. "You've always been a fighter, Sandra. If anyone can make a difference, it's you." Sandra reached for her aunt's hand, squeezing it gently. "You taught me that, and you've spent your life fighting for others. Now it's my turn to fight for you." As Carol rested, her body finally beginning to recover, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The night's events had been painful and frustrating, but they also highlighted the importance of speaking out against injustice. With Sandra by her side, she knew they could turn this experience into a catalyst for change. The fight wasn't over, but they were ready for it. The ripple effect. Carol woke to the soft rhythm of beeping monitors and the faint hum of hospital activity beyond the curtain. Her body felt heavy, her shoulder immobilized in a sling, and a dull ache pulsed through her forehead where the stitches pulled at her skin. She blinked a few times, letting the room's muted light come into focus. Sandra was still by her side, her laptop open on a small table. Her fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, her expression a mix of focus and frustration. Carol could tell by the set of her niece's jaw that she wasn't simply browsing. Sandra was strategizing. "Still at it?" Carol asked, her voice raspier than she intended. Sandra glanced up, her face softening when she saw her aunt awake. "Always," she said, closing the laptop and shifting closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" Carol tested her body with a small shift, wincing at the tightness in her shoulder. "Sore, but better," she admitted. "Thanks to you and Dr. Alvarez." Sandra gave a faint smile, but the tension in her shoulders remained. "Dr. Alvarez is incredible. She stayed well past her shift to make sure you were stable before leaving. Not everyone in this hospital deserves to wear a white coat, though." Her voice carried a sharp edge as she spoke. Carol sighed, her thoughts returning to Dr. Miller. "Sandra, I appreciate everything you're doing. But this isn't new. People like him, they've always existed. They always will." Sandra leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "That doesn't mean we accept it. You taught me that." Carol's lips twitched into a smile, pride shining through her weariness. "You're right. But this fight is personal," Sandra interrupted. "And it's systemic. You weren't just ignored because of one man's bad judgment. It's a reflection of a system that doesn't see people like you until you flash credentials or demand attention." Carol nodded slowly. Sandra wasn't wrong. She had seen this pattern too many times in her life, in her career, and now, in the one place where she should have been safe. It was exhausting to constantly prove her worth, but she knew Sandra wouldn't back down. She never had. While Carol rested, Sandra stepped outside to make some calls. She stood in the hospital courtyard, pacing as the cool morning air bit at her cheeks. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Another response to the messages she'd sent to her network. "Agent Bennett." The voice on the other end greeted her. It was Stephanie, a colleague in the FBI's Civil Rights Division. "I got your email. What's going on?" Sandra quickly outlined the events of the night. The crash, the blatant neglect by Dr. Miller, and the broader implications of what she witnessed. "This wasn't just bad judgment," Sandra said firmly. "It was bias. My aunt wasn't treated like a priority because she didn't fit his idea of what urgent looks like." Stephanie was silent for a moment. "You're sure it was bias and not an overwhelmed ER?" "I'm certain," Sandra said. "I watched him prioritize a sprained ankle over a bleeding head wound. It wasn't just negligence. It was dismissive." Stephanie's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "This could fall under civil rights violations if we can prove a pattern of discriminatory treatment. Do you want to escalate this?" "I do," Sandra replied without hesitation. "And not just for my aunt. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it won't be the last unless we take action." "All right," Stephanie said. "Send me everything you have. Statements, timelines, any recordings if you've got them. I'll start a file and loop in our legal team. But you know this won't be easy. Hospitals have powerful lawyers." Sandra's jaw tightened. "I'm not looking for easy. I'm looking for justice." Back in the hospital, Carol was visited by Officer Martinez, one of the patrol officers who had initially assisted her. Martinez carried a warm smile and a small bag of snacks she picked up from the hospital cafeteria. "Mrs. Johnson," Martinez greeted, placing the bag on the bedside table. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing." Carol's smile was genuine. "Thank you, Officer Martinez. I'm doing much better now, thanks to you and your partner." Martinez waved off the thanks. "We just did what anyone should have done. It was your niece who really lit a fire under this place." Carol chuckled softly, her eyes shifting to the doorway where Sandra had just re-entered. "That she did." Martinez turned to Sandra, her tone becoming more serious. "I also wanted to let you know we filed a report about the other driver. We found the SUV abandoned a few miles from the crash site. It was stolen, which explains why they ran." "Any leads?" Sandra asked, slipping into her investigative tone. "Not yet," Martinez admitted. "But we'll keep you updated. In the meantime, if there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to reach out." Sandra nodded. "Thank you, officer. And I'll make sure your report ties into what I'm filing on the hospital's negligence. Martinez's brow furrowed. You're filing something against the hospital? Yes, Sandra said firmly. My aunt didn't get the care she needed when she needed it. That's unacceptable. Martinez nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Let me know if you need a witness statement. I saw how long she waited before being seen. That would help, Sandra said. Thank you. As the day wore on, Carol drifted in and out of sleep while Sandra worked tirelessly. She contacted local advocacy groups, drafted emails to hospital administrators, and coordinated with Stephanie to strengthen the case. Every so often, she glanced at her aunt, whose peaceful expression belied the emotional toll of the ordeal. In the evening, Dr. Alvarez returned to check on Carol. She reviewed the latest test results and adjusted Carol's pain management plan. You're making good progress, she said, offering a reassuring smile. If things continue to improve, you could be discharged tomorrow. Carol sighed in relief. That's good news. Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Alvarez hesitated, then added, I also heard about what your niece is doing. Filing a formal complaint against Dr. Miller and the hospital. Carol glanced at Sandra, who met her gaze steadily. She's determined, Carol said softly. She always has been. Dr. Alvarez nodded. It's a brave thing to do. The medical field needs accountability, and unfortunately, it often takes incidents like this to force change. It shouldn't take incidents like this, Sandra said, her voice firm. But as long as they happen, we'll keep fighting. Dr. Alvarez smiled faintly. Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad someone is. If you need a statement from me about the delay in treatment, I'll provide one. Sandra's eyes widened slightly. You'd do that? Yes, Dr. Alvarez said simply. This isn't about protecting colleagues or avoiding conflict. It's about doing what's right. For the first time that day, Sandra felt a sense of hope, not just for her aunt's recovery, but for the larger fight ahead. With allies like Dr. Alvarez, she knew they had a chance to make real, lasting change. That night, as Carol slept soundly for the first time since the crash, Sandra sat by the window of her aunt's hospital room. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the weight of the day settled on her shoulders. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she also knew she wouldn't walk it alone. This wasn't just about Carol. It was about every patient who had been dismissed, overlooked, or mistreated. It was about demanding better from a system that should prioritize humanity over bias. And Sandra was ready to fight for all of them. Sandra leaned against the windowsill, her thoughts racing as she watched the city lights flicker in the distance. The hospital buzzed with muted activity behind her, the muffled voices of nurses, and the steady hum of machines creating a strange sense of calm. But Sandra's mind was anything but calm. She opened her laptop again, pulling up the draft of her complaint against the hospital and Dr. Miller. Each word was carefully chosen, every detail meticulously documented. She had listed the timeline of events, the clear neglect her aunt endured, and the stark contrast in treatment between patients with less severe injuries. Sandra's FBI training had taught her the importance of precision and thoroughness, and she poured that expertise into the document. The door to Carol's room creaked open, breaking Sandra's focus. She turned to see Dr. Alvarez stepping in quietly, a clipboard in hand. The doctor smiled softly when she saw Sandra still at her post. "You're working late," Dr. Alvarez said, her voice low to avoid waking Carol. Sandra closed her laptop with a sigh. "There's a lot to do," she replied. "This isn't just about my aunt anymore. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Dr. Alvarez nodded, pulling a chair closer to Carol's bedside. "I admire your dedication," she said, glancing at Carol, who stirred slightly in her sleep. "But this fight can take a toll. Make sure you're not carrying more than you can handle." Sandra straightened in her chair. "With all due respect, Dr. Alvarez, I've seen systems fail people like my aunt time and time again. I won't let this slide, no matter how long it takes." The doctor's eyes softened. "I understand, and I agree." People like Dr. Miller give the medical profession a bad name, but you're taking on a system, not just one doctor. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Sandra leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "What made you step in tonight?" she asked. You didn't have to take over her case. Most people would have just followed protocol. Dr. Alvarez's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've seen this before," she admitted. "Patients like your aunt being overlooked or dismissed because they don't fit the profile of urgency. It's something I've fought against my whole career. Tonight wasn't about protocol. It was about doing what was right." Sandra's respect for Dr. Alvarez deepened. "Thank you for that. You probably saved her life." The doctor waved the gratitude away. "She's a strong woman. But strength shouldn't be the only thing keeping someone alive. That's what we need to change." As the night wore on, Sandra found herself replaying the events of the past 24 hours in her mind. The crash, the ER, Dr. Miller's dismissive attitude. It all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle. She realized that this wasn't just about negligence or bias. It was about the systemic barriers that allowed such behavior to persist. Around 3 a.m., Sandra's phone buzzed with a new email. She opened it to find a response from Stephanie, her colleague in the FBI Civil Rights Division. Subject: RE, Hospital Negligence Case. "Sandra, I've reviewed your initial complaint and the supporting evidence. This has the makings of a strong case, especially if we can gather more testimonies from other patients or staff who've experienced or witnessed similar treatment. I've reached out to our legal team, and they're ready to assist. Let's schedule a time to talk tomorrow and strategize next steps. Best, Stephanie." Sandra exhaled deeply, relief and determination intertwining. She forwarded the email to herself for safekeeping, knowing it was the first step in a long battle. Morning light streamed through the hospital room window, casting a soft glow on Carol's face as she woke. Her movements were slower, more deliberate, but there was a spark of clarity in her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. "Morning, Aunt Carol," Sandra said, smiling as she closed her laptop. "How are you feeling?" Carol adjusted her sling and winced slightly. "Like I've been hit by a truck," she joked weakly. "But better than yesterday." "Did you sleep at all?" Sandra shrugged. "A little," she lied. "There was too much to do." Carol frowned, her gaze steady. "Sandra, you can't take the weight of the world on your shoulders. You need to rest too." "I'll rest when this is over," Sandra replied firmly. "You deserve justice, Aunt Carol, and I'm going to make sure you get it." Carol studied her niece for a long moment before nodding. "You've always been stubborn," she said with a small smile. "Just make sure you're fighting smart, not just hard." Later that morning, Dr. Alvarez returned with the discharge paperwork. "You're free to go, Mrs. Johnson," she said warmly. "But you'll need plenty of rest, and I'll schedule a follow-up appointment to check on your recovery. Physical therapy will be essential for your shoulder." Carol nodded. "Thank you, doctor, for everything." Dr. Alvarez hesitated. "Before you go, I want you to know that I've spoken to the hospital administration about what happened last night. They're aware of the complaint being filed, and I've offered to provide a statement. Change has to start somewhere." Sandra's respect for the doctor grew even further. "Thank you," she said. "Having someone like you on our side makes a big difference." Dr. Alvarez smiled faintly. "Change doesn't come easily, but it's worth fighting for. Good luck, both of you." As Sandra wheeled Carol out of the hospital and into the crisp morning air, they both felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was uncertain, but they weren't walking it alone. With Sandra's determination, Carol's resilience, and allies like Dr. Alvarez and Officer Martinez, they had the foundation of a movement that could ripple far beyond one night in an emergency room. This wasn't just about Carol. It was about challenging a system that had overlooked too many for too long. And together, they were ready to make waves. Building the case. The drive back to Carol's home was a quiet one. Sandra drove carefully, her eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. where she could see her aunt's weary but calm expression. Carol sat in the passenger seat, her arm cradled in its sling, gazing out the window as the city passed by. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on both of them, but Carol couldn't help noticing the determined set of Sandra's jaw. Her niece was a force of nature, and Carol knew that Sandra's mind was already racing ahead, plotting every move in the fight against the hospital's negligence. "You're too quiet," Carol said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft but firm, laced with the warmth that only family could provide. Sandra glanced over briefly, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Just thinking," she admitted. Carol chuckled lightly. "That's what worries me. When you're quiet, you're planning something big." Sandra didn't deny it. "It's not just about you, Aunt Carol," she said. "What happened last night? It's bigger than one incident. I can't stop thinking about how many other people might have been ignored or dismissed, people who didn't have the means or the badge to demand attention." Carol nodded slowly. "I know, Sandra, but you have to take care of yourself too. This isn't a sprint." Sandra sighed, her grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "I know, but every time I close my eyes, I think about that doctor laughing while you bled on a stretcher. I can't let that slide." When they arrived at Carol's modest home, Sandra helped her aunt out of the car and up the small flight of steps to the front door. The house was cozy, filled with framed photos of family, community events, and church gatherings. The familiar scent of lavender greeted them as they stepped inside. Carol eased into her favorite armchair, sighing with relief as Sandra arranged pillows to support her injured arm. "There," Sandra said. "Comfortable." "As comfortable as I can be," Carol replied, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Now sit down, Sandra. You've been running nonstop." Sandra hesitated but finally sank into the couch across from her aunt. She pulled her laptop from her bag, opening it with a practiced efficiency. Carol watched her for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're not resting," Carol said knowingly. Sandra looked up, her expression unapologetic. "I'm compiling everything I have so far. Officer Martinez offered to provide a statement, and Dr. Alvarez said she'd back us up too. I want to get the formal complaint filed today." Carol shook her head fondly. "You're relentless, you know that." Sandra grinned. "Learn from the best." Over the next several hours, Sandra worked tirelessly, reaching out to contacts in the legal and medical fields. She called Stephanie again, providing updates and discussing next steps. Together, they decided to file a multi-pronged complaint, one against Dr. Miller individually for negligence and bias, and another against the hospital for systemic issues in patient care prioritization. Sandra also began reaching out to advocacy groups that specialized in healthcare discrimination. She knew that amplifying the issue beyond their personal experience would be critical. By mid-afternoon, she had scheduled a meeting with a local chapter of a civil rights organization that focused on healthcare equity. Carol, meanwhile, rested as best she could, occasionally offering Sandra a word of encouragement or advice. Despite her own exhaustion, she felt a deep sense of pride watching her niece work with such focus and determination. Sandra wasn't just fighting for her. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been dismissed or ignored in a moment of vulnerability. By the evening, Sandra had compiled a detailed case file, complete with timelines, witness statements, and a summary of relevant legal precedents. She printed several copies, organizing them into neat folders. "All right," she said, sitting back with a sigh. "First thing tomorrow, we're meeting with the legal team. They're confident we have a strong case." Carol nodded approvingly. "You've done a lot in one day, Sandra. Maybe now you can rest." Sandra hesitated, glancing at her laptop as though it might sprout another task to complete. But when she saw the concern in her aunt's eyes, she relented. "Fine," she said, closing the laptop. "But just for tonight." Carol smiled, her voice warm. "You've earned it." As Sandra prepared to leave for the night, there was a knock at the door. Both women exchanged a curious glance before Sandra moved to answer it. She opened the door to find Officer Martinez standing on the porch, her expression both apologetic and determined. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," Martine said, holding up a small folder. "But I wanted to give you something." Sandra stepped aside to let the officer in. "What is it?" Martinez handed her the folder. "It's a copy of the preliminary report we filed about the crash and the other driver. I thought it might help if you're building a case against the hospital. It shows the timeline of events and when we brought your aunt in. It backs up what you've been saying." Sandra's eyes widened as she flipped through the pages. "This is perfect. Thank you, Officer Martinez." The officer nodded. "Your aunt didn't deserve what happened to her. And you're right. This isn't just about her. If there's anything else I can do, let me know." Sandra nodded firmly. "I will. And thank you." As Martinez left, Sandra returned to the living room, holding up the folder. "Looks like we got even more evidence," she said, her voice tinged with satisfaction. Carol chuckled softly. "You're like a dog with a bone, Sandra. You're not letting this go, are you?" "Not a chance," Sandra replied. "This is just the beginning." Later that night, as Sandra finally lay down to sleep in her apartment, her phone buzzed with a message from Stephanie. Message from Stephanie. "Great work gathering everything. I've looped in our public relations team. If you're comfortable, we should consider bringing some media attention to this. Let me know what you think." Sandra stared at the message, her mind racing. Media attention could bring the issue to the forefront and force the hospital to respond publicly. But it could also bring scrutiny, backlash, and pressure. It wasn't a decision to take lightly. She texted back, "Let's discuss tomorrow. I'll talk to my aunt first. This is her story too." With that, Sandra set her phone down and closed her eyes, her mind still buzzing with possibilities. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like they were gaining ground. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Sandra was ready for them. Together with Carol, she was determined to turn this personal pain into a broader movement for change. The fight for change. The following morning dawned crisp and bright, but Sandra's focus was sharp as ever. She arrived at Carol's house with fresh coffee and pastries from a local bakery, balancing the tray with one hand while juggling her laptop bag in the other. Inside, Carol was seated at the kitchen table, her arm still in its sling, but her demeanor calmer, more composed. "Morning," Sandra greeted, placing the coffee in front of her aunt. "I hope you're up for another busy day." Carol chuckled softly, taking a sip of the steaming brew. "With you around, I don't have much choice, do I?" Sandra smiled but didn't deny it. She slid into the chair opposite her aunt, opening her laptop and laying out the game plan for the day. "I've got a meeting with the legal team in an hour. After that, we're sitting down with the advocacy group I contacted. They're interested in using your story to shine a light on systemic healthcare disparities." Carol raised an eyebrow. "My story?" Sandra hesitated. "I wanted to talk to you about that. Stephanie suggested we consider media attention. It could pressure the hospital to take immediate action and also raise awareness about what happened. But it's your call. If you're not comfortable with it, we won't go that route." Carol leaned back, her expression thoughtful. "Media attention. You mean putting my name and face out there for everyone to see?" Sandra nodded. "It's a big step, and there's no pressure, but it could make a real difference. People are more likely to pay attention when there's a human story behind the issue." Carol's fingers traced the edge of her coffee cup as she considered the idea. Her entire life had been about quiet service, helping others without seeking recognition. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless people who had suffered in silence, who had been ignored or dismissed because they didn't fit someone's preconceived notion of importance. "Let's do it," Carol said finally, her voice steady. "If my story can help others, it's worth it." Sandra's face lit up with determination. "I knew you'd say that. Don't worry, Aunt Carol. I'll be with you every step of the way." The meeting with the legal team was intense but productive. Stephanie had arranged for Sandra and Carol to speak with a group of civil rights attorneys specializing in healthcare discrimination cases. Sandra presented the timeline of events, the witness statements, and the supporting documentation, including Officer Martinez's report. One of the attorneys, a sharp-eyed woman named Dana Park, listened intently as Sandra laid out the case. "You've done an impressive job gathering evidence," Dana said, flipping through the files. "This is a solid foundation for both a legal complaint and a public campaign." "What's the next step?" Sandra asked, her voice steady. "We'll file a formal complaint with the hospital's board of directors, citing specific violations of patient care standards," Dana explained. "Simultaneously, we can initiate a federal investigation into systemic discrimination within their emergency department. The media attention will bolster both efforts." Carol, who had been mostly silent during the meeting, spoke up. "And what about Dr. Miller?" Dana's expression hardened. "We'll file a separate complaint against him with the state medical board. His actions, or lack of them, crossed the line into malpractice. If we can prove a pattern of similar behavior, he could lose his license." Carol nodded, satisfaction mingling with a quiet resolve. "Good. People like him shouldn't be allowed to treat patients." Later that afternoon, Sandra and Carol met with representatives from the advocacy group, a diverse team of activists and community leaders. The group had already reviewed the case file Sandra provided and expressed a strong interest in amplifying Carol's story. "We've been fighting healthcare inequity for years," said Maya, the group's director. "Your story is a stark example of why this work is so important. If you're willing, we'd like to use it as a centerpiece for our upcoming campaign on patient rights." Carol hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing on her. What exactly would that involve? Maya leaned forward, her tone empathetic but persuasive. "Interviews with trusted media outlets, public speaking engagements if you're comfortable, and sharing your experience through our networks. We'll make sure your voice is heard, but we'll also protect your privacy as much as possible." Carol glanced at Sandra, who gave her an encouraging nod. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," Sandra said softly. "But this could really help people." After a long pause, Carol took a deep breath. "All right," she said. "If it helps others avoid what I went through, I'll do it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Carol's story was featured in several prominent news outlets, sparking widespread outrage and calls for accountability. The hospital released a carefully worded statement, promising to review its policies and investigate the incident. But Sandra and the advocacy group weren't satisfied with vague promises. They pushed for concrete action, demanding systemic changes and accountability for Dr. Miller. The public response was overwhelming. Letters of support poured in from people across the country who had faced similar experiences. Carol read each one, her heart aching for the pain and frustration so many had endured. But the messages also fueled her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. In a packed press conference organized by the advocacy group, Carol stepped up to the podium, her sling still visible but her voice strong. Sandra stood nearby, her presence a steady source of support. "I'm here today because I was ignored when I needed help the most," Carol began, her voice clear and steady. "But this isn't just about me. It's about a system that fails to see the humanity in everyone. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Her words resonated deeply, the room falling silent as reporters and attendees hung on her every word. By the time she finished, the applause was thunderous. The fight was far from over, but the tide was turning. The hospital faced mounting pressure to reform its policies, and Dr. Miller was placed under investigation by the state medical board. More importantly, Carol's story had become a rallying cry for change, inspiring others to come forward and demand better. As Carol and Sandra sat together one evening, reflecting on the journey, Carol reached for her niece's hand. "You've done so much, Sandra," she said softly. "Not just for me, but for everyone." Sandra squeezed her aunt's hand, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We did it together. Aunt Carol. And we're not done yet. The fight for justice was ongoing, but they knew one thing for certain. They weren't alone. And together, they would continue to make waves that would ripple far beyond this single story, creating a legacy of change for generations to come.